that I put underneath to raise the camera is the book that think I have mentioned to you called The Creative Act.
The
And
creative
The Creative Act.
act, the
And
creative act.
it,
Okay.
it's by a guy named Rick Rubin, who's a very famous music producer, record
Mm-hmm.
producer.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote this book um, where he basically describes um, all the dealings that has had over decades of producing records with various recording artists and a wide variety of artists and genres. And and it turns out that the book has been very popular. It's only been out for about a year and a half, and it's sold almost 1 million copies. So it's really hit a chord. And I think somehow in the world today, creativity and the idea of being inspired, and that everybody wants to be, even if you're a banker or accountant, not necessarily only if you're an architect or dressmaker, you still want to be known both for yourself and for those around you as being a creative thinker. And so the book kind of appeals to that whole area. Rick Rubin's idea is basically that whether they know it or not, everybody is creative. And then what he tries to do in his book is give people thoughts and things to think about, exercises that help them tap into their own creativity, even if they don't know that it's there. So.
Exactly. And people often say, no, 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 I'm not really creative. And they don't seem to see how much creativity they need to have and utilize when they produce what they produce on a daily basis.
My first job out of business school was at an advertising agency.
You went to
And
business school,
and
Steve?
yes, yes, I
Okay.
did.
Mm-hmm.
And in the agency, it was a pretty big agency in Chicago that I worked at, and there were a number of different departments. There was the account management department, there was the media department, there was the search department, and there was the creative department.
Mm.
You know, and so that helped reinforce the idea, to your point, I think, that the people in the research department were not encouraged to think about themselves as creative. They were in the
Exactly.
research department. They weren't in the creative department. And it was interesting because I remember each department was on a different floor. And so when you went to the research department, it was very businesslike, and there were lots of stacks of computer printouts. When we went to the media department, there was all the stuff for radio and TV. And when you went to the creative department, it was total and complete chaos. There were people skateboarding down the hallways and everything. And so there was an idea that creativity had to do with what you surround yourself with and the types of things that you do, which are basically out of the norm. And I think that when you think of somebody like Steve Jobs, for instance, I mean he was in a very technically oriented business, and but it was the way he thought about what he was doing that was creative. And that's the thing. In a way, if you can be taught to let your mind wander and to think about those things that even have nothing to do with the main goal at hand, maybe that's kind of what creativity is all about. I mean, I just found out I have a second grandchild now,
Oh, congratulations.
and so it will be interesting to see, what he is like and how he is the same or different from his sister. But um, you can be very creative as a child, and I'm sure his parents will do a lot to encourage his creativity. But you can also be creative as a parent, and you can be creative as a grandparent. And it means just basically paying attention to the things that you're thinking about, and not being afraid to kind of follow up on them and do maybe you take your grandchild out to, to do something, some kind of like the last time I was in London and we were visiting, we took our grandchild to a like a nursery, and there were plants that you could buy, but there were also play areas for the kids, and so it was just a completely different environment than what she was experiencing at home. So the idea of being able and willing to step outside of the norm, I think, has a lot to do, and that brings up. I think the word creative can even create problems,
Oh,
because
yes.
so when you're a banker, you might almost think that being creative means unlawful. So it's something that you don't want to do. But I think being creative is just not accepting the norms and being able to put your mind outside of the way you've been normally taught to think about something.
Well, I would like to add to that. I wonder whether if people will look at themselves and think, well, this is what I do. I don't know, maybe they I don't know, driving a bus. And whether they will think, well, to do my job, I do create something. I create my driving. I create my environment
Yeah.
in my I create the style of my driving or
Yeah.
style the way I communicate with my passengers.
What you said about bus drivers is actually very interesting because now in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, I find that I'm taking more buses. And when I get on some buses, it's very businesslike and a little bit stilted and not very social, and everybody's quiet. And on other buses I get when I get on, I always say thank you because they lower the bus, so it's easier for me to get on. And some drivers don't respond at all, they're just like a blank face. And other drivers are very effusive. They'll say you're welcome. They say, how's your day going? They want to know what my stop is, so they make sure I don't miss it. And so. uh, I think actually creativity goes beyond what we normally think of as a creative act, and it can be who you are as a person. It can be how you relate to other people. It can be the environment and the experience that you create for those who encounter you. So
Yes,
the idea of looking at creativity in a very creative way is actually pretty interesting.
very indeed. Um, as you were telling this bus story, I was thinking that you are a very creative person. You've been in publishing business for 40 years or 30 years or
I would
40?
say I would say informal for 30 years, but formally where I'm actually publishing books just for about 10 years. So previously I was involved in various aspects of publishing, but when I'm really responsible for bringing a book out, that's really been relatively recent, the last 10 years, I suppose.
And as you were saying that, I was thinking how the buses made me think of asking you about you. And I thought buses are a transport. They take you from one point to another. It's a travel, it's movement, it has some sort of timeline as time, and also it has geographical line. And I think that's what stirred my next question about yourself. What was your journey? What was your journey? What is your passion? Just something, whatever comes to mind, because I know that you have so many interesting stories. You are like a Pandora box.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the idea of journeys and geography, and not so much now because I've lived in Brooklyn for a long time, but I remember at one point in my life, I kind of defined success and living a creative life in terms of the geography that I was in. So I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, and I was there for 18 years. Then I went to Chicago, and that's where I went to college. And I remember, my first summer after my first year in college, I went back to my hometown and worked there. My second year, I stayed in Chicago. My third year, I was in and around New York. My fourth year, after I graduated, I went to Alaska. Uh, then, after graduation, I was back in Chicago, and then I took some time off and decided that all my friends had been to Europe, which I had not, and so I quit my job and I took off with the idea of spending a year, and I was going to go around to the world. And I was gone for a year. I didn't make it around the world, but I covered a lot of European and Northern Africa and geography. So the idea of expanding my universe geographically from a small town in the Midwest to uh, Europe, and I actually was able at some point to go to Japan as well. So this idea of an ever expanding geography has been very interesting to me. And but I mentioned I've not done so much traveling now, but there's a different. I haven't done a lot of geographical traveling, but there's a different kind of mental traveling, I guess, and that has to do with the traveling that one can do through books. And
Ah,
the idea that the book that you and I are working on is very interesting because it has to do with um, going back in time to 1933 when the book from your grandfather came out. That has to do with the time and geography and ways of thinking. So, the idea of journey and travel and creativity, all of that ends up kind of getting into a big, interesting mishmash, I suppose.
well, they say life is a journey. And
Mhm.
also, I think, how does it go? About the happiness, people say the happiness is not a destination, it's a journey.
Not the arrival.
No,
It's the
ah, yes,
journey.
not the arrival, yes,
Not the arrival. Yeah.
but the
And
arrival.
actually, I just got off a phone call earlier with an architect that I'm working with. And journeys can be of different kinds as well, because he and I are working on a book, and we've been thinking about it probably in not a very creative way, but we had a clear idea of the destination that we thought we wanted to get to. And then in a meeting with somebody else last week, they said, "Well, maybe we should look at it this way and not that way." And that was a very creative thought and a much more interesting idea. And at first, I was hesitant to adopt that idea because I thought it's going to be more expensive, it's going to make more time, save more time. But then it hit me, it's a really more interesting way to go. And so I was a little bit hesitant to propose it to my architect collaborator because it was going to take a lot more time and a lot different type of thinking from him. But I explained the idea and he loved it. So all of a sudden, because of a single thought that one person had mentioned, we're on a new journey now in a much more interesting, creative way. And if the book actually happens, it'll be much more interesting and valuable. And it'll partly relate to some of those things that Rick Rubin talks about in his book, but where it's really about exposing our readers to a different way of thinking and a way of inspiring them to come up with their own ways of looking at their own situation as somehow different and giving them ideas. There are basically five core disciplines that we have focused on. Let me see if I can remember all five: architecture, fashion, graphic design, interior design, and product design. Those are basically the five core areas that we think of that architecture and design schools focus on. But there are all kinds of related design disciplines that go along with that. So we don't confine ourselves only to those areas, but that's an easy way to describe it.
Well, I remember mm, you watching a very short video of yours where you on YouTube where you were looking at the books that you have in your personal possession. And
Yeah,
I remember you were saying something along the lines that I wonder when I look at the books that I have, how does it reflect who am I?
yeah,
So I don't know when did you take that video, but I presume a little while back. But and I don't know whether you had an answer to that question at the time. But if you were to think, or if I was to ask you about it today, how the books that you have now or have had do resonate with who you think you are, what you are, or what you do rather.
yeah. Well, somehow and for some reason, books have always been very important and interesting to me. And in fact, maybe they relate to that idea we were talking about before of taking a journey. Because what does a book do? It can really take you in one place and help you get to a different place uh, mentally, how you think of yourself or how you think of yourself going through the world. Like I'm looking at my bookshelf in the other room, and some of those books I've had for 50 years, you know,
Mm.
and sometimes I don't think about them at all. But other times when I see the title and I think back to some, well, that's a book that I read my freshman year in college, you know, and then I think back to, oh yeah, that was that was the quarter that we spent studying countercultural literature in my humanities class. And I think about some of those ideas. The books actually expose you to a different world, so that's something that you incorporate. It maybe changes you a little bit or a lot, and you might not even like now. I don't think about those thoughts that I thought about 50 years ago when I first read some of those books. Um, but they have just become like a part of me. Let me see if I can remember some of those books. Remember Trout Fishing in America by Browdigan, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe, Ken Kesey, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Norman Mailer, Armies of the Night. I mean, these are books. It was 1970 when I was reading them, and most of them were written during the 60s. And so you know what we think about the 60s in terms of creativity and what a creative time that was. And so these it's interesting to be able to look back and even for a book that I may not have picked up for 30 or 40 or 50 years, there's a certain calm, I guess, or a certain insight that I get just from having these things close by, even if I haven't opened the book for a long time, but just seeing it there on my shelf and knowing that it's still a part of my life, I get great pleasure from that, as odd as that may sound. So,
I love books myself, and I have books which were in my family before I was born, way before I was born, and have books which are more than 100 years old, and they came to me from my family, so they acquired them. And I also have books on different languages because different members of
yeah,
my family spoke different languages, and and I like old books.
If you hadn't said that, I was going to, but so you've got the content of the book, but then also very different is the language the content is delivered in. So you have a lot of different angles that books relate to you on.
Very true, because when the book is being translated, that is a it's different because another person put their input, their thinking, and their creativity into the book because you cannot really translate as word into word. You have to interpret. So you
Yeah,
really
yeah,
have to be so much tuned in into the style, the essence of the text, and the idea of that text,
yeah, yeah,
or speech if it's a speech recording transcription. And then in your language, with your style, combining, well, it has to be your style, but at the same time, it has to be the style of the original author,
yeah, yeah,
to translate it to a degree that the reader connects with the origin, original work as much as they can. Um, I always prefer reading books and watching films or listening to recordings in the original form when I can.
yeah,
Unfortunately, I only
yeah,
speak two
yeah,
languages, so if
yeah,
anything in outside of these two languages, it's I have to do use translation.
yeah, yeah.
But I love books. I just like to take it out of the shelf or off the shelf and just look at it and touch it and admire it. And I guess I then can am connecting with the emotion of feeling a reason as to why I purchased it, if that was acquired by myself, or if it is book which was acquired by my, let's say, parents or grandparents. Uh, I guess I am connecting at that moment with my old memories, with the memories from my
Yeah,
childhood and with my family roots
yeah,
in a and it's important. And I have Kindle, and I bought it as soon as they came out, and I don't use it. I hardly used it. I'm so drawn to a paper copy or whatever it is printed on, for as long as it's actually
yeah.
tangible material which I can touch and feel and either scroll or flip page one after another.
Well,
Uh,
for the books that we publish, uh, we think of them in three ways. I mean, there are probably even more ways, but sometimes I find it's very helpful, even if it's obvious what the criteria are, it's helpful to be able to say them. Obviously the content is very important. So that's kind of what relates to your mind. Um, the graphic design and the visual presentation is very important. So that's the part that relates to your eyes. Um, but then also and you mentioned this, there's the part of when you pick the book up, it's when you feel it, the tactility of it. So if you get a book that really relates at a very high level in all three of those different criterias, then you know you've got something very special. And,
but
and I think books are interesting because they do relate on all of those levels. And so even if you're not actively reading a book, as you mentioned, you can look over into your bookshelf and you see it. So you still have a connection with it. And on an audible book, audio book, you don't have that connection. And
but
I'm looking at, I've got some albums over there that are 50 years old. And sometimes I look at them and I look at the album and, I know it's on the cover, and so it still relates to me. And as good as YouTube is, like last night I played an hour's worth of Beatles songs. It's really great. It just went from song to song to song, so that was terrific. But when the song is over, there's no material reminder of what that song is about. And so an album cover, if it's, and a lot of those album covers, especially from the 60s and so on, were very innovatively and thoughtfully done. So I like things where there's multiple levels of communication with the listener.
That is very true. I remember those times when uh, the CDs started, when you still had to buy the actual physical CD.
Right. Interesting when you think of the evolution of technology, you start out with an album cover, which I don't know, 12 or 13, 14 by 14, whatever it was. And some of them were done very interestingly. I think Sergeant Pepper was the first album that I read somewhere where the lyrics to all the songs were actually printed on the cover, the album cover.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mm.
and so sometimes they were done very interesting like that. But then when you evolved to CDs, all of a sudden, you know, you had a much smaller live area to communicate. So you couldn't do the same thing on a CD cover that you could do on an album cover. And then when you go to Spotify or to YouTube, you know, all of a sudden, you know, the physical manifestation of it completely disappears, and all you have is the audio. So as technology advances, there's also a certain degradation of the experience that you have with the material. So I think what that leads us to is the conclusion that uh, either or is not better. What's better is both and, you know. So if you can have the album and the CD and something that makes your music very mobile, then you're better off.
I don't know how it is in
Yeah,
the States, but in UK, that's why I'm in London. Um, it is a tradition to send Christmas cards. And it's very
yeah,
sweet
yeah.
and lovely tradition. And I know that some people do replace them with the electronic ones, but post is being very
Mhm.
busy. Post office is being Royal Mail very busy
Yeah,
over
yeah, yeah.
Christmas period, not only
Well,
with presents but cards, and that is just so nice to observe. And this is where I like
yeah,
the reservedness and traditionalism of British soul.
yeah. Well, I think that reinforces the idea that th those people that can look at the world as a both and proposition and not an either or proposition are better off. I, you know, there are times when the convenience of email is very nice. But when you actually receive something in the mail from somebody and you know they've taken the time to select it for you,
Oh,
they've taken the
yes.
time to write it and address it. I mean, all of that communicates a different, more meaningful message.
It just
So,
absolutely different. Mm.
yeah, yeah.
Do you know what I was want to ask is since we're talking about books and you do a lot of facsimile copies or publish or
Right,
organize them to be published. And I've seen
right.
at least one gorgeous book that you kindly sent me. And the execution is better than excellent. And so it had an original copy of the original copy, original copy of the original book. And also it had an accompanying same size, same format, same style. How would you call it? Book? Because it is a book.
We call it a reader's guide.
Reader's
Reader's guide.
guide. Reader's
Yeah.
guide. But that reader's guide, it's a separate book. It's an
Yeah.
an accompanying
Yes.
book to the book. And it has a sleeve where they sit all together.
Right. Mhm.
And
Right.
it's produced to an extent that as soon as I opened the copy itself, I could sense the energy of the artist. It
Mm.
drawn me in totally, completely. And also when I started looking at the reader's guide, it took me even onto a further journey, talking about buses and journeys at the beginning of the conversation.
Well, I think basically, I mean, first of all, it obviously comes about as a result of um, being intensely interested. So there has to be a connection to the material that draws you to it. And then you, you want to, you form a team for these things. Everything in life that seems like it's worth doing somehow is not just a solitary project, but it involves a team. So you get people that view the world in the same way that you do. So, for instance, with that Lewis Kahn book that you're talking about, um, I came across that book in the library. I thought, wow, this is really something special. Maybe this would be worth doing a facsimile of because it occurred to me that the book was originally published in 1960. So, and now out of print. So a lot of people probably had never heard of it before. So we started doing some research and we found out that the the author of the book about Louis Kahn was still alive, and in fact he had worked in Louis Kahn's office, so there was that direct connection that the author of the book, Richard Saul Wurman, knew Kahn, and the book was all about Kahn's drawings. And so we were able to get in touch with Richard Saul Wurman, and it was interesting. We told him we wanted to do a facsimile of the book, and at first he said no. Look, I'm only interested in the future. I'm not interested in the past, what I did before. I want to do new things, and that reminded me of I did a lot of work with the Frank Lloyd Wright archives, and Wright was famous for saying, famous for the fact that when he bought a car, he had the rearview mirror taken out of the car because he said, "I'm never interested in what's behind me, only what's
Well,
ahead." And so, but Richard Saul Ruhrman was the same way. He was interested in the next project, not the past one. And so I asked him a couple more times, how about it now? We really want to do this facsimile, and he said no. Then I was talking to him at one point, and I mentioned the idea that we not only wanted to do the original book, but we wanted to do the reader's guide, which would be published similarly. All of a sudden, he got very interested because the idea of doing something new in conjunction with something old, because it had been 60 years later, and there were a lot of new thoughts that he'd had about Louis Kahn that he wanted to make known. And now in the Reader's Guide, he could do that. So he finally agreed we could do the facsimile edition as long as we did the Reader's Guide, which was fine with us because that's what we were thinking of all along. And then Richard Saul Ruhrman is a really interesting person. He has very high standards. He's done a lot of all kind. He's done many books. He's done conferences, and they're all done at a very high level. So his specifications about how to do something were probably even higher than ours, and so we had to conform to what he wanted to do, put which helped us think more creatively about the project. So in the end, it was a collaboration, not only about history and about something that happened a long time ago, but something new that we were creating as well. And that's what we try to do with all of the projects that we get involved in. Most of the projects are facsimile related, and that's how we hope that the project with your grandfather book will work as
thank you.
well.
Yes, that would be really nice. But apart from my grandfather's project, which is a book of my grandfather, Yakov Chernikov, who was a uh, architect and constructivist, and he also was very much interested in fonts. And hopefully it will come out. But apart from that project, which is again, thank you so much for paying attention and being interested, and in my grandfather's work. But apart from that, what other projects are currently on your in your current books? On the current in the current on the in the current chapter of your life?
Well, there are a number of things. Um, I've been to Japan 3 or 4 times, and I'm very intrigued by Japanese culture. And it turns out that there are several books on Japanese architecture that came out at about the same time that the book on Louis Kahn came out, but they've been kind of forgotten. So there is a book on the Katsura Imperial Palace outside of Kyoto, and Kenzo Tange and Walter Gropius collaborated with a photographer, his name is Ishimoto, on a book in 1960 that there were 138 Ishimoto photographs and then essays by Tange and Gropius. And so we're trying to put together a facsimile edition of that book. There's a book on a metabolist Japanese architect that was printed in 1970 called Kurokawa. And that is an incredibly interesting book because not only was there the hardcover book, which was done very interestingly by a Japanese designer. So in terms of how the visuals were dealt with, it was very innovative. But along with, in the whole package, there was the hardcover book and a large, like a 2 foot by 3 foot poster printed on both sides. And then as well, there was a 45 RPM record included with the book, and all of that was in a slipcase. So we're trying to see if there's a way to put that together as well. Um, so that's in terms of the facsimiles. So we're excited about the possibility of doing and then one other Japanese project I almost forgot is with the metabolist architects, which they were active in kind of the 60s and 70s. A lot of people don't know, but they actually did a monogram, a metabolist monogram. And I somehow came across that. In fact, here's the book, the
Oh,
Metabolist Manifesto. It's not an elaborate book, but it was very important when it came out. Basically, it has all the tenets of metabolism that are spelled out here. And it's very um, it's very interestingly done. There's one gatefold in it. Anyway, so we're trying to put together a project on that as well, which also will have a reader's guide as well. So those are facsimiles, and just very briefly, I'll mention we're actually first time we've done original publications. There are 2 series that we're thinking about. We're trying to put together. One is looking at historically important architects and designers from the 20th century, people like Buckminster Fuller, Herbert Bayer, um, Joseph and Annie Albers, Corbusier. And what we realized is all the designers and like that are very well known, but it's very easy to know their names and not actually know what they stood for. Their core, the core design learning that you could learn from them. So we're putting together a series that will do that. And then before we were talking about Rick Rubin and the idea of creative inspiration. And it occurred to me that a lot of people who either are creative and are having problems continuing to be creative, or people that want to be creative and just don't know how to do it. A way to inspire them is for those who are known for their incredible creativity
Mm-hmm.
to point out the material that has inspired them. So
Mm.
we're going to do a series of books on creative inspiration, which well, so the earlier series I talked about focuses on dead designers, and then this other series will focus on living designers and the things that they can point out that to them inspire them and urge forward their creativity in new ways. So those are basically the projects that we're looking at now.
Oh, I think that how did you say creative inspiration or inspiration for creativity?
Either way works, but
Yes.
the way that we have shown it
I
is
think
creative inspiration.
I think that could be an excellent topic for our next chat, hopefully
Yeah,
soon.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Well,
yes.
we've talked to several different architects about being involved in it, and it seems to be of interest to them too. Because sometimes designers like to talk about their work. But this would not be about that. This is not about these specific projects and the specific work. This is about the ideas that inspired them to do projects. So and sometimes for the outsider, it's actually the inspiration for the project. Even though they can appreciate the project, it's the inspiration that led to it that is actually more interesting
Mm.
or more helpful in terms of doing their own work. And that's what we hope to do. The whole idea of doing this series is that um, this is meant to help the reader go beyond where they currently are and get to a new place. One of the in doing my research on these books, I came across a quote from Albert Einstein on creativity, which a lot of people have generated a lot of quotes about creativity. Not all of them are very creative, but Einstein's I thought was very good because he said um, creativity is looking at something that everybody looks at, but thinking things about that nobody has thought of before. And I thought that's really it. So it's like looking at this, but not just looking at it straight on, coming from this way or the other way. And so that ability, which by the way, I just thought about this, but uh, we can all agree, I think, that the sixties were a very creative time, a lot of very
I
interesting
think
things
it,
going on.
unfortunately, it was before my time.
Yeah.
I would love to visit it. There was a time
Well,
machine.
maybe you've read about it,
Yes, of course. I know it's
but
lovely period.
the Beatles and Mary London was the center of
Oh, yes.
creativity at that
Yes.
time. There were just so many interesting things going on. But I actually heard a George Harrison interview where he's talking about one of the things that helped spur his ideas about how to think of the Beatles' music and move it to the next step was this whole idea of experimentation with LSD and some of the
Oh, yeah.
drugs that that that's a whole different thing, and there are problems associated with that. But in
Of
his
course.
case, he said that the reason that was useful is because he was really able to approach things that he had been thinking about for a long time,
Mm.
but somehow he was completely cut loose from all the history of that thinking, and he was able to view it in a totally new way.
Mm.
And so and I think that also it helped, like I've read as well, that Paul McCartney made a habit of going around and there was a lot of experimentation in the art world going on at that time. And McCartney was completely open to not only focusing on music, but he was looking at a lot of other things that were going on in London at the time, where people were being very creative and he brought that into his overall experience, which had a role in his music then. We talked about Steve Jobs before, and he's talked about the idea of creativity and coming up with new ideas. And uh, he said that sometimes in focus groups and talking with people, or I don't believe that he believed in focus groups, because he said that you can't really ask people what they don't have and what they want, because they don't know what the possibilities are. So
Yes.
so he said that's very hard to do. And what that led him to do then is to really focus on, he didn't necessarily try to design or come up with ideas that he thought would fill a need that had been identified and presented to him. He really wanted to think up things that he felt were a really good idea just on his own. And when you think about maybe 20 years ago, it would have been very hard for somebody to think about having a device in their pocket, which was a telephone and something that you could send messages to anybody in the world on, and also that you could connect to information sources, so these are basically the smartphone does now. And so when I'm in the subway, every single person in the subway in New York has a smartphone with them now.
Yes.
So, but if you'd asked people 20 years ago, they never would have said, "Oh yeah, I want a smartphone." But all of a sudden, when it's created and presented to them as an option, I mean, I read about the penetration rate of smartphones. I mean, something like 90% of all people now have a phone like that. But
Well,
not that
yeah,
long ago, not that long ago, it
it
wasn't
was the
even
other way
viewed
around.
as something that was possible.
Well, we're coming back to the how our minds work, how our body works, what limitations we impose on us, on ourselves, how the society affects us, how our the surroundings where we were brought up, our immediate family and school, and people who are important to us affect us, and what limitations they either put limitations, or the other way around. There are people who are so creative in their parenting and teaching, they they embed some belief into the person, a child, a baby, that there are no limits, that you can just think and dream, and somehow transfer that ability to think and dream, uh, which is very known for children, transfer into your adult life. And I think the role of society is very important here. And yeah,
Well,
interesting subject.
it's interesting. Like when you find out, like people like Shohei Ohtani, which is a baseball player, or I don't know how big he is in the UK, but like in the United States, he's a Japanese. Uh, he's from Japan, but he's been a hugely important figure in American baseball. But people like Ohtani or other athletes, or like Tiger Woods is the same way. These people kind of burst onto the scene, and we kind of see that when we first become aware of them, it's almost like they are fully realized individuals in their area of expertise. But what we don't know is the years and years of practice that they had to
Mhm.
put in,
Yes.
and also to your point, frequently their parents have either guided them or open up the opportunities for them to be acquainted with these certain areas that they now excel in. So
Mm.
the idea of what's behind such tremendous expertise and performance is sometimes not all that visible, but very important.
Very important, and that made me remember that for many years, surprisingly, I was fairly old. I mean, not a child. And even in my 20s, I sometimes would start comparing myself to some, let's say, doesn't matter whoever known person, saying, "Well, they achieved this and I haven't," and da, 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 da. And the clever people would say, "Kate, but look, they have." teams and coaches and a lot of support and resources behind them, and they don't do everything by themselves.
Yeah, yeah,
And it makes me think that, or takes me to the topic of your peer group, your what is behind, who are and who are those people who are behind you. I mean, who are your supporters? Who are your um immediate group of people? And how do they support you? How do they talk to you? And here, I mean, the style, the language they use, how supportive that is. How
yeah,
does
yeah.
it, what affects that approach of theirs makes on you and allows you to either thrive or not. Hopefully, the first
Yeah,
one.
yeah,
And it is just so important. And coming back to books, because books are also written by someone, and these books have a lot of thoughts, and they have a lifetime behind them. What I mean is, every author before they wrote and published a book, they lived a life. They had something to collect to collect the experiences, put them into thoughts, find the meaning for themselves, then find the meaning for other people who will be reading that book, and publish it. So it's a lifetime, it's a life story or stories behind every book, even the smallest one. And the books then, maybe that is actually one of the reasons I like books so much, because they are also my peer group, my my supporters, because there is a soul, there is a human being behind every book.
yeah,
And the quality of production, the paper, the print, the decoration, the illustration, the font,
right.
the colors. That is important, because if you surround yourself by quality, uh, it does lift me up. It does
Yeah, yeah,
resonate with who I am and who I want to be and how I want to do things. And then when I surround myself by books which were produced well,
yeah.
that feeds into my self-confidence and my joy in life. And that is probably one of the reasons why I like them sometimes. When I sometimes like taking them off the shelf and holding them in my hands, and not only
Yeah.
admiring the content of the book, but actually the presentation.
Well, Kate, the idea of quality that you mentioned is also something that Rick Rubin focuses on in his book. And I think you said surround yourself with quality. And
Yes,
I think that that's almost like a direct quote from the book. He says, uh, find the most interesting architecture, find the most interesting books, literature. Uh, Pick out the things that are really good and choose very carefully. Cultivate the idea of be a curator of your own life and choose what you spend time with. And this ties to something else that you said. Choose people that you spend time with in the same way. You know,
yes.
that you can contribute to positively, but also people that will contribute to you positively. And if you keep that in mind about uh, giving and quality in your entire life and everything that you do, that in fact will help develop your own sense of curatorial meaningfulness, so that then can affect your sense of doing great work. I mean,
And
hanging
that
out
sense
with
of
great,
self as well.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So all of that relates, I think.
Mm. Well, it made me think about two phrases. One is, we cannot not affect each other. We always do affect each other. And it is so important, like you said, to be very attentive to who is surrounding you. Where are you taking
Mm,
yourself, into which group, which will be surrounding you, with whom
mm,
you will have that energetic and mind exchange, thoughtful exchange, and exchange of creativity as well. And it was not always conscious. A lot of it is unconscious. It's very important. And another thing, another phrase I remembered, it's a friend of mine, Bill Phillips, who is a very successful and known coach, therapist, and he said once to me, Kate, when you or anyone wakes up and then they look around themselves, and every morning by looking at what is around you, you say to
mm.
yourself, or your unconsciousness says to itself, this is who I am, this is what I do. And if we surround ourselves with quality people, what we consider quality, with people who bring us joy, people who are with whom we are on the same page, as they say, with people who are,
Right.
we are in good rapport, where we feel um, joyful, relaxed, at home, and those that inspire us. And the same applies to things, uh, people, and things that are not comparable by all means, but nevertheless, we need things in our lives. And
Yeah.
therefore,
Well,
those things that we do acquire and surround ourselves with, to me, it's very important to have um, what I consider quality.
it's about how design affects our lives. And maybe architecture is the most obvious example. I mean, you can think about you're in some spaces and it's dreary, the color is bad, the proportions are bad,
Yes,
the placement of the furniture is bad. There's nothing about it that makes you feel enlightened. There are other places other spaces you're in where the lighting is uplifting, the way things are placed makes a lot of sense. Um, I went to a doctor's office a week or so ago, and it was just the most boring, uninteresting, sickly space. I thought I didn't know how a good doctor could possibly have their office in a building like this because it's almost walking through the hallways to get to his office made you need his service. So, I agree with you that all of these things are choices that we make. And I think Ruben's idea is that if you surround yourself with quality and with things that are really inspired and where there's been a lot of thought in them, that will have an effect on you and can hopefully then affect how you make your own choices and how that affects your own work ultimately.
exactly.
It's all related, isn't it? So.
Yes,
And also, I think it's important for us to think about and to understand that it's not just about three-dimensional objects that we're speaking about here. It's also about experiences. And I don't know if you have had this experience or not, but I have noticed that if I'm feeling down, if I'm feeling drab, if I'm feeling angry, that it's really easy for me to project those feelings. And all of a sudden, everybody that I'm dealing with feels the same way.
no, yeah,
It infects everything that I psychically touch. Conversely, if I can be of presence of mind and be mindful where I'm thinking positive thoughts and I'm not angry. And I've often thought that with my daughter, for instance, I'm usually like on my best behavior. I want her to have a good experience when she's around me. So I behave as good as I possibly can. And if she does something that upsets me, I don't get upset. I treat her specially. You know, I try to keep an even perspective on things. And I've realized that if I was able to treat all the people that come in and out of my orbit in the way that I treat my daughter with that same sense of thoughtfulness and caring, how might that affect how I'm treated in the world? In other words, it's kind of infectious, you know, and it's kind of like that idea of karma. You know, what you
Mm.
put out, you get back. And
Well,
if you can,
mm,
you know,
um,
if you can treat everybody with a kind of mindfulness and thoughtfulness, where basically you're being very positive with people. I don't want to get too ridiculous about this, but I think that to a certain extent can have an impact on how we get treated as well. So what goes about comes about to a certain extent.
well, I
I'm
just
not sure
wanna.
that will.
Mm.
I'm not sure that will help deter nuclear war, but in our own personal dealings, it might help.
Well, I don't know. Well, you saying it made me remember that very recently I've been at the in the party at Chelsea Arts Club in London, and someone asked me what are my favorite fashion designers, and one of my favorite fashion designers is Vivienne Westwood, who passed away not that
Mm.
long ago. And I have a bag, and on a belt, on a stripe, it says, "What you put in, you take out." Or you take out what you put in, resonating with you get what you seeded,
Yeah,
what you planted, and that feeds again back into creativity and to what you surround yourself with, because it your surroundings or books. We talked about books a lot, and people. They are these. You can't call people things, but for the purpose of the sentence, I'll say these things. They surround us, and
yeah,
they're like nutrients, nutrition, and they are those components by which we are nurturing ourselves, our soul, and our creativity too. And it's so important to
yeah,
have, I think, the correct surroundings for being creative, because creativity does require some relaxation, some joy, some happiness, some content. And that there will be another topic as again at some point, because when we are not in those kind of surroundings, then our brain starts functioning differently, and we lose part of our creativity. Not lose totally, but lose for that period of time. And there is, if we go into worse and worse situations, or situations are becoming worse and worse around us where we're placed at the time, then we go into a survival mode. And whilst we are in the survival mode, we cannot possibly create. And going back to the beginning or middle of the conversation when we were talking about how important it is where you are being brought up, and you talking wonderfully about how you behave around your daughter and how supportive you are. So she is undoubtedly a very lucky child. Well, she's probably not a child herself anymore since you have grandchildren, but for you, she always will be a child. And so the point I'm making is that so important to surround children and people with energy, which inside which they can be actually creative and not being in the survival mode, but in the state of creativity.
right, yeah. I agree with all that, and you, by the way, are very good about creating an atmosphere and an environment for the free exchange of ideas like this. So, thank you very much for doing that. This was all very enjoyable.
Thank you, Steve, and we shall see you again very soon.